morning we are discussing an introduction to contemplation under the title, The Flower of the Five Senses. In our discussion last week relating to the celebration in honor of Buddha, we pointed out the foundation of his philosophy, namely that the cause of suffering in man lies in the intensification of the sense of selfhood within his nature. In Indian philosophy, selfhood or identity arises from the alchemy of the five sensory perceptions. In other words, at any given moment, the individual is the summary of his own perceptions and his reflections thereon. Instead of being an unchanging creature or having within himself an unalterable identity, the individual is in a constant state of psychic motion. He is changing with every experience of his life. And where growth achieves its normal and proper end, the individual's unfoldment is measured in terms of his own composite selfhood. Therefore, if he is growing as he should, the selfhood within him unfolds like the flower, develops and enlarges, and becomes a compatible being. Growth is therefore an overcoming or an outgrowing of those pressures, tensions, and inabilities within the person which cause his difficulties in social adjustment. The properly growing person is therefore normal. And we use this term normal much as we might apply it to the problem of physical health. We know that it is natural and proper for the physical body to be well. And by being well, we mean to be adequate, to serve properly, to be a suitable instrument for the manifestation of the being within it. If this body falls away from normalcy for any reason, an abnormal condition sets in. This abnormal condition we call disease, or sickness, or lack of function, or a state of unhealth. In the same way, it is normal for the psychological entity in man to be an integrated, comfortable, happy, progressive creature. It is normal for the individual to have healthy attitudes toward everything in life. If he falls short of these healthy attitudes, he is psychologically sick, in the same way that the body, falling short of normalcy, may be said to be sick in some way. In our modern way of living, we have come to assume that a state of unhealth, because it is prevalent, is normal. We assume that the individual who can really say that he has had a long and healthy physical existence is an exception to the common rule, that therefore he is abnormal. He is more than normal, perhaps. He is a shining example of something. For we assume that man will live with aches and pains through his life. We have also come to assume that the person in man is normally irritable, normally tired, normally unhappy, normally critical, selfish, self-centered. And because these conditions are prevalent, we accept them, we excuse them, and we overlook them, unless they reach psychotic proportions. The normal person then today is a mixture of agreeable and disagreeable elements. He expects to be accepted as such. He expects to be respected for his virtues and to have his vices overlooked. He expects to have as much comfort, happiness, pleasure in living as possible, but he has no intention of modifying his own conduct in order to merit a better destiny. Gradually, in one way or another, we have come to accept an abnormal condition because of its prevalence, and because we can say, if someone criticizes us, you are doing no better. We can point out our neighbors and say that they are manifesting the same imperfections that we have. Therefore, why should we do anything about it? By degrees, thus, compromise has reduced our desire to correct our own faults. And the physician will tell us that the same is true on a physical level of health. The only thing that inspires the individual to any strenuous effort to restore health is when sickness so impairs his ability to do as he pleases or to be economically independent that he must take some step in order to restore his individual existence. Unfortunately, sicknesses of the psychic life do not immediately impair our economic stability, nor do they seem sufficiently pressing to cause us to take the necessary remedy. Man physically is moved to correct his illnesses because of pain in part. Discomfort is so intense that he must seek a remedy. That which we call pain in the physical body has its likeness in distress in the psychic nature. This distress may take the form of inordinate greed, or it may manifest through self-pity or a persecution mechanism. In one way or another, however, we are also psychically suffering. But as this is not a physical pain, and because of our natural tendency to excuse ourselves and to establish what we consider adequate grounds for our unhappiness, we consider the situation essentially normal and bear it as best we can. Thus, with great patience, we endure ourselves a situation that is not entirely constructive. It is not necessary for us to go through the world as though we were bearing upon our shoulders the weight of the world's woe. We should not feel that we were predestined and foreordained to be miserable. We should not believe that there is a virtue in continuing to suffer for mistakes which are essentially evidences of weakness of character. It is more than suitable and proper that we should take the necessary steps to integrate the resources that we have, realizing our remarkable endowments, that of all creatures we have the most wonderful potential for adjustment. It becomes our proper responsibility to see that this adjustment is advanced, that we make use of the powers that we have to overcome this core of ignorance which lies within ourselves. As Buddha also well pointed out, the universal disease is ignorance. And ignorance exists in many ways and in many levels. The most difficult for us to understand is what we would term cultured ignorance, that kind which arises within persons who apparently have made good use of the facilities of their time. The individual who is obviously uninformed, we can understand in part at least. We realize that we cannot expect of him more than his own nature can contribute. On the other hand, the misinformed person has so completely concealed the core of ignorance that he is unaware of it himself. Yet his various forms of information which he may possess have not been suitable to restore or integrate himself. Thus the person can be learned and informed and apparently civilized, and still retain within his nature an abysmal depth of uncertainty and negation which should not be there, and which will not permit a normal or happy life, nor permit him to make a satisfactory adjustment on the level of personal relationships. Thus it is essential that we give some thought to these very serious and very real problems. One of the difficulties that have appeared in recent years has been the psychological materialism which has complicated rather than clarified the situation. Psychology handled totally on a materialistic level it becomes largely a defense and excuse mechanism. It is little more. And the trend in psychology is to establish the individual as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. This trend is notable in the various techniques used in diagnosis and therapy. The individual is suffering because, and then we come into a whole group of things that could contribute to his suffering. He is suffering because psychologically he is a misfit. He is born out of time. He belonged perhaps 500 years ago, but he lives today. Another group of individuals would like to believe that they belong 500 years in the future, but were cursed by being born today. There is also that group in whose lives certain environmental tragedies have apparently frosted the hope and adjustment of the individual. He is the victim of parental negligence, the victim of a broken home, the victim of a bad environment, the victim of misunderstanding on the part of that society of which he is a part. All of these attitudes and these various explanations fall short of the fact. For the fact is that regardless of all these other statements, the individual is the victim of himself. We know that environment is a common heritage. We all inherit it. Yet each individual reacts to it according to his own nature. Therefore, it is his own nature which determines whether environment will damage him or not. And it is also his own nature which determines whether he can repair this damage, whether his natural instincts are sufficiently buoyant and constructive to enable him to be victorious over circumstances. If he is not victorious, the answer must lie in the inadequacy of his own equipment. It will be a long time before we can look forward to a world in which everyone will be so thoughtful, so careful, so conscientious, that there will be no cause for stress in the life of the individual. This would be a golden age, and unfortunately we would not flourish well in it even if it came. Inasmuch as most of us are so addicted to patterns of suffering that we assume that life is enriched and made purposeful by what we have to endure as the result of other people. Take away from many folks the privilege of suffering, and they would have no reason to live. They would have no distinction. They would not be able to make a life conversation out of what they have been through. Such individuals would be hard put for a reason for existence. Actually, while it is true that we must live in a world, the environment of which is made up of the psychic natures of other persons, we are still in a position to accept this pressure as an invitation to growth. We are in a position to recognize that we are endowed with powers and potentials by which we can achieve security even in an uncertain and untranquil environment. All this brings us directly to our problem of man's sensory life and the recognition that constantly man is accepting into his psychic nature forms of nutrition, foods, or even poisons, which are the consequence of his sensory perceptions and his interpretations of their testimonies. Actually, man's sensory perceptions, basically, are comparatively honest, even though inadequate. When we look directly at a thing, we see it. When we feel it and touch it, we know that it is there. If it has an odor of some kind, we can smell it. If it makes a sound, we can hear it. These things we know. And largely speaking, these testimonies are true, inasmuch as the sensory structure itself is a kind of machine. And like all machines, it merely fulfills a function or a purpose, and does so almost automatically. Thus we have no real complaint against sensory functions unless these are impaired by sickness or accident. It is not, therefore, that we live in a world which we know through 5 windows that we get into trouble. The trouble lies in the fact that to each individual, the testimonies of the senses must be interpreted, and each must interpret according to his own egoic complex, or according to the condition of the person within his body. Thus it follows that we have what we call tastes, likes and dislikes concerning things. One person looking at a work of art says that it is beautiful. Another says that it is not beautiful. One individual sitting down to a meal finds it palatable. Another individual pushes the plate away and says he does not wish it. Now actually, the meal is as useful to one person as to the other. Yet through some other circumstance or cause, to one it is tasteful and to another it is distasteful. We call these things differences, either of temperament or of disposition, or of likes and dislikes. And we wonder why these differences exist. Yet the merchant is glad that they exist, because they mean an infinite variety of desires, which are fulfilled through a wonderful display and diversity of merchandising. Thus some prefer automobiles of one color and some another. And these preferences are apparently harmless, and in fact give variety and pleasure to life. But when one individual says, I prefer this to that, there will always be another individual who is hurt as the result. There are a great many people who are offended if we do not eat the meal if they do not eat the meal which we prepare for them. They feel that we are wrong, that they like the food, therefore we should. So all through life, things are complicated by individuals saying, I like this, and others should. I do not like this, others should not. And as we go further into abstractions, where problems become more complicated, simple likes and dislikes can become the base of feuds that go on for years. And the acceptance and rejection of temperaments may result in friendships or animosities, which may have a powerful effect upon living. These selections, these discriminations, which arise within our own natures, are not simply the results of the things we see or taste or hear or feel. They come as the result of the condition of the person in the body and his ability to accept honorably and usefully the various stimuli that the sensory perceptions provide. Thus, the kind of a world we live in depends very largely upon our own interpretive power. If we are naturally pessimistic, we can take all the sunshine out of the most beautiful day. If we are optimistic, we can see many good things on the most clouded and storm-riven day. Most depends, therefore, upon the individual's own ability to interpret constructively the experiences that occur to him, and to recognize also in this interpretation the inalienable right of others to their interpretations. Therefore, not to personalize, not to center his attention upon the mere fact that what he likes must become the universal pattern. In the individual, the power to interpret, or the tendency to interpret, is closely associated with selfhood, or the term I. I like this. I do not like that. When we like something, we defend it. When we do not like it, we attack it. Why? Because it pleases or displeases us. And what is this us that we live to please, and whose various attitudes we either offend or defend as the result of our conduct? This peculiar sense of selfhood, against which Buddha spoke so strongly, is a kind of fixed and immovable standard that we have erected within the interior part of our natures, and which we must defend because it is us, because the individual identifies this standard with the totality of his own being. He therefore feels, in his present state of living, that the accommodation, the satisfaction of this self, this is important. And to this, all other things must take a subservient position. This self, as it continues to manifest down through the ages, has blocked practically every effort to reintegrate the structure of society. Nearly all research, all problem, all psychological investigation runs into this self, and there it is blocked. The individual and the scientist both assume that in some way this self is inevitable. It is like the mysterious revelation of the Oracle of Delphi. This self is the voice of the gods. It is the inevitable demand of the being. It is something which cannot be challenged. And yet it is in this self, very largely, that man's waywardness lies. And experience over thousands of years has shown that this selfhood, this selfness in man, is not inevitably right, is not inevitably good, and that the satisfaction of this and the catering to it, the humble servitude toward it, these attitudes and practices have not solved anything. In modern psychology, the adjustment of the self to society is regarded as highly important. Here we have two elements that are as abstract as the most abstract speculations of Einstein. There is no case where relativity is more obvious ethically than this effort to adjust the self to society, because no one has found a satisfactory definition of the self nor of society. No one knows what such an adjustment would be. No one knows the great demand of the self nor the great demand of society. And the reconciliation of these two is at best but a kind of truce, an armistice in an eternal warfare which is going on between the sense of selfhood and all other factors in the broad experience of man. There is the self and all else in each person. And the study of this identity and the reason for the terrific tyranny which it exercises must be sometime approached on a more intelligent level and with less adoration for the preservation of the self-concept or the self-complex. Eastern philosophy assumes that this tyrannical adoration of self, not in word but in groveling servitude throughout life, the individual never or very seldom assuming that he should cross this self in anything, and living in a state of constant resentment because society restricts the full and free expression and abandon of this self. We endure laws, but we personally dislike them because they prevent us from doing exactly as we please. Yet when we are given an opportunity to do exactly as we please, frequently we do nothing. For even this tremendous pressure within ourselves is so unstable and uncertain and inconsistent that we hardly know how to gratify it. The self then sets up this standard to each person, a peculiar infallibility, this sense that he is always right, even though in his mind he knows that he is not. If the pressures from this self become too insistent, very few persons can resist these pressures. Ultimately they take over, and the individual becomes the victim of his own tyrannical attitudes. Until we examine then this self in its own nature, until we realize that this mysterious fountain of pressures within ourselves is not the true and natural object of our devotion, until we know this, we are going to continue in our troubles, and even the best school of psychology is not going to save us. We cannot find the solution through the gratification of ego pressure, nor can we find it merely through the release of ego pressure. Truly, we can reduce tension to a degree by getting certain things out of our systems, but the source of tension remains and will continue to build as long as man continues to interpret life as a sphere of tension, and continues to assume that tension is a necessary evil. He will continue thus to assume until he himself overcomes the cause of tension. And this cause of tension is his own defense of ego, his own defense of his own infallibility. And of course, because he is not infallible, the defense process becomes very intricate and very excessive. The struggle to defend that which is not right is always greater than the struggle to defend that which is right. For in nature and in man and in all the great patterns we know, that which is right does not need defense, and that which is wrong cannot be successfully defended. Therefore, the struggle of the individual to protect a failing or a weakness in himself is an endless struggle without reward. For ultimately, he must correct the mistake, or the pressures will go on indefinitely. We cannot assume, any more than Confucius was able to assume, that man can make an instantaneous and dramatic adjustment to a better state of life. Growth must be a gradual process based upon observation and contemplation. The individual observes daily the solutions to all the problems that he faces. But his observations are not honestly and adequately recorded within himself. In his reflections upon the various pressures around him, he arrives mostly at a core of self-pity. He does not recognize his own responsibility to find truth in the testimony of the five senses. He recognizes only that these bring to him reports, which perhaps are pleasant and perhaps unpleasant. And these reports in turn affect him and agitate him, but do not necessarily solve anything for him. Out of the core of man's egoism arises what we term self-consciousness. That is a kind of consciousness in which the factor of self is forever the dominant equation. It is a kind of consciousness by which we measure things, weigh things, analyze them. But when we weigh them, we always sit on one end of the scale ourselves. We are perfectly honest, except it must be our way. We are quite true, quite sincere, quite certain that we are going to give this matter full consideration. But by some strange coincidence, the truth is always what we demand it to be. We have decided beforehand in the best form of medieval scholastic philosophy, because in this school everyone calculated from the effect and not toward it. In other words, a man arrived at a conclusion and then set about the process of proving it. Well, if he arrived at a conclusion, he could prove it by one very simple mechanism: ignore anything that disproved it. If you have 5 friends and 4 of them differ with you on something, there is one simple solution: give up the 4 friends. You will then live without conflict. In the same way, in studying life around you, if you carefully eliminate from your thinking everything that differs from it, or if you acknowledge it at all, you acknowledge it only as a burden and a symbol of someone else's ignorance. If you take this attitude, you can gradually eliminate all intellectual competition. And you can come to the conclusion that you are completely right because you have removed all evidence that you are wrong. This happens legally sometimes when people burn the papers, and in that way solve an intricate problem of law. But the fact that we eliminate all competition does not make us right. It only means that we have systematically destroyed the opportunity to learn. We have carefully eliminated those pressures in society around us which could have inspired us to grow. When we do this, we cease to grow, settle back, and remain absorbed in our own miseries for the rest of life. Self-consciousness can never be completely honest because it is prejudiced basically by the significance of self. Self-consciousness moves around the self-focus. It moves around the concept of comparison between self and that which is not the self. It moves upon a pressured and prejudiced axis. It turns upon the concept that this self-consciousness is qualified to pass judgment on other things. Now, of course, when you say this to people, they get a little bit unhappy about it all. One expressed it simply: how will we ever come to any decision if we cannot make use of self-consciousness? How can we decide anything? If we wish to accept the position that the inside of us does not know, then how can we arrive at any conclusion? Do we not simply then become mere shadows or ghosts with no central point of energy? It might seem that this is the case, but I think practice assures us that there are very few people who are going to carry this technique to such an excessive end. The individual is not going to relinquish self completely, particularly in this kind of an evolutionary pattern. But he is going to have to begin to recognize that the source of his trouble lies in the tyranny of unenlightened self-consciousness. Now, the most immediate remedy is not to stop making decisions, but to begin the education of the decision-making factor. And how do we educate this factor? We know that we must educate it by the very nutrition which we supply it. Actually, the decision-making factor is composed of experience plus interpretation equal consciousness. We know, therefore, that what this consciousness is, in reality, is something or someone living in a small room with only very small communication channels leading out into the world, and that this person who must make judgment from this oracular sanctum in our subconscious depends for the materials of that judgment upon the testimonies of the senses and the interpretations thereon. If, therefore, false reports are sent in to this consciousness, its decisions are correspondingly untrue. Actually, the purpose of self-consciousness is that it shall be the focal point for the distribution and dissemination of the attained intelligence of the individual. Self-consciousness is a clearing house, a place where various facts are distributed, recognized and accepted, and applied to the purposes most useful to the growth of the individual. There is nothing essentially wrong with this focal point if it is used properly. But when this focal point is distorted by false attitudes or false concepts, it can no longer produce or fulfill its own essential purposes. Instead of being a true point for the distribution of useful information, it becomes a prejudice agent. Now, we may liken this, perhaps, to a common consciousness pattern that we know in life. For we have created in this world what we call the fourth estate, the press, the newspaper, now extended to include television and radio. The method, theoretically, the means by which we should inform mankind of the action of mankind. That which immediately occurs, that which is happening now is news. That which happened last year is history. News is therefore a vital means of communication. It enables the individual to have a fair and unprejudiced opinion of the world around him. But what happens when great news services develop their own political or social or autocratic complexes and begin to distort news in order to gain some particular end or advantage at the expense of the public good? When this happens, we say that we have a controlled or directed press, and we begin to doubt whether we can believe what is in the newspaper. For we suspect that this particular paper will leave out anything that is good about its adversaries, and will leave out also anything bad about its friends. And as this goes on, we find the newspaper gradually becoming a propaganda instrument, and its practical value as an honest means of distribution of knowledge is lost. This is exactly what happens in the term of self-consciousness. The moment the self-consciousness becomes an autocratic or dominated instrument, addicted to a policy, and that policy not truth, the moment this happens, it no longer serves its original and constructive end of distributing to man and enriching his faculties and powers with factual information. No individual can actually be hurt by a fact, because a fact, accepted factually, while it may not at the moment be agreeable, is a new source of strength. But where this fact has been destroyed, has been distorted or disproportioned by some prejudice, then it is no longer useful, is hurtful, and may cause the individual to embark upon a career which will end in tragedy. Thus, what we term self-consciousness should be the clearinghouse for the testimony of the senses and normal, proper contemplation and reflection thereon. A contemplation or reflection dedicated to the discovery of truth, and a truthful report which is conveyed to consciousness to serve as a help and a guide in the further decision of the individual. If his life is enriched factually and truthfully by experience, he becomes ever better equipped to carry on a useful and constructive career. But if his fact-finding organization is prejudiced and is bound to some allegiance other than truth, then his life will not be so profitable. And wherever the individual is not living constructively, optimistically, and creatively, it simply means that his fact-finding equipment is bound to an error, deceit, or falsehood of some kind. There is something present which is not true, and the individual is defending not truth rather than truth. And the defense of error is the cause of misery. Now, there might appear to be occasional exceptions to such a broad statement, but as we examine these deceptions and exceptions, we find that basically there is a degree of error wherever there is lack or loss of adjustment. If then self-consciousness, as we call it, is nourished and sustained and integrated from experience plus interpretation, how are we going to attack the correction of our problem? We cannot change experience. There is no reason why we should. because experience, whether we like it or not, is factual. And the experience of the individual is the inevitable result of the effect of what he is upon society and the reaction of society to what he is. Thus, experience is inevitable, and it will always be found on the level of the individual's function. There is nothing essentially wrong with the fact of experience. The reason it hurts is because it is telling us that we are wrong. And that's something we dislike to hear even from our best friend. This idea that your real friend is the one who tells you you're false is not as popular as we might think. It is only true when we are telling someone else they're false. Then we demand appreciation. If then the fact of experience is not wrong, and all facts gathered from experience are factually true, and if consciousness, or so-called self-consciousness, the integrated entity in man, if this is merely the consequence of experience and reflection thereon, then the trouble must lie at neither polarity, because the self cannot be anything else than what it is. It is an effect, a consequence, and not a cause, as most people believe. There is only one place, then, where the damage has been done, and that is on the level of interpretation. It is the individual moving in upon the fact and trying to force it to conform with his ideas. It is also the individual trying to interpret a fact in the terms of his previous wrong adjustments with life. He is moving from patterns of self-pity, from patterns of psychological pressure. He is moving from a basic paranoia or something of that nature if he refuses to accept the fact and communicate the truth to consciousness. In this middle ground, then, lies the reason why we have such a difficult time trying to live well. And why, when the apostle said, whenever we would do good, evil is always nigh unto us. It is in this interval also that fact is diluted or perverted by the sense of selfishness. The moment we over-personalize the fact, accepting it in terms of merely pain or pleasure, we get into trouble also. We accept certain interpretations because they are pleasant, also because they do not challenge. We reject others because they do challenge or because they are unpleasant. We do not accept or reject upon utility, upon value. One way or another we interfere until finally we have developed within ourselves a focus of self-consciousness which resents, which hurts and aches and pains and shudders and trembles, and is totally unfit to be the leader of a new pattern for living, nor can it supply us with the total of its own research so that we can apply this equation to our judgment and thus come to a better conclusion about something. It is as though we had a large research file that we could call upon as precedents in legal research, various entries which we should turn to in order to understand how to face a present dilemma. But in this filing system, instead of truth, is a large and carefully arranged collection of falsehoods. We turn to them, and because they are not true, they do not serve us. Or if we take them and try to use them, our difficulties are compounded. Then we get more and more fatalistic and blame society for our misfortunes. So we have in us this wonderful, strange, incredible interpreting power. This power to take things and invest them with overtones and undertones, and to distort them and to exaggerate them, and finally to believe these interpretations above the fact. This interpretive power, moving almost totally from previous interpretation, means that the self or self-consciousness within the individual is so loaded with error, so loaded with previous wrong conclusions, that all it can contribute to judgment or interpretation is error. Thus, consciousness on the level of thought and emotion, which form the interpretive media, is constantly indoctrinating these powers with its own ineptitudes. It is loaded itself with error, and it imparts this error to these faculties which must interpret experience. This creates a vicious circle, and the individual continues only to do what he has always done, think as he has always thought, and finds neither resource nor incentive to break through this vicious circle of his own errors. Now, to break through a tremendous circle of such pressures is in itself very difficult. And to take the various faults that are in there and one by one try to kill them out is an extremely tedious, arduous, and apparently for a long time unprofitable endeavor. But there are two ways in which we can approach this. One is with our usual belligerence, a vast enthusiasm that lasts for a week, and after that, like a New Year's resolution, vanishes in limbo. Another way of straightening out the situation is to recognize that error is always pressureful. Wherever there is pressure, there is too much of something. Wherever there is pressure, there is untruth. Because truth does not cause pressure. Truth can cause only one final emotion, and that is admiration. That which is true and is known to be true is accepted. We do not become pressureful because the sun rises in the morning and sets at night. We do not become pressureful because water runs downhill. We do not become pressureful, really, because we have to eat and rest, nor do we become pressureful over most of the natural phenomena of life. We accept it and adjust to it without pressure because we know there is nothing we can do about it. Somewhere along the line, we've got to also take this strange attitude toward truth. When it comes to the matter of truth, there is nothing we can do about it, which is exceedingly fortunate. Because if we could do anything about it, we would. And the moment we try, truth disappears. Truth is a matter of acceptance. And it is not the cause of any difficulty other than it may remind the individual that he has been foolish for a very long time. This may be unpleasant, but actually it is therapeutic. It is a very wonderful discovery to make. Thus, the solution to most of the problems that we have relating to pressure is to recognize that our interpretation of experience, if it is intense, if it is pressureful, is the cause of the psychic pressure in the self-consciousness. If the individual is not pressureful in his report to consciousness, consciousness will not be pressureful in its reaction. Actually, consciousness is merely bearing witness to the pressure. It is not the cause of the pressure. Consciousness is not the cause of any pressure. It merely becomes a focal point in which whatever is present is revealed. Therefore, so-called consciousness pressure is merely pressure upon consciousness by the mental and emotional structures. This pressure, coming into consciousness and redistributed, continues the mental and emotional pressure. And this pressure problem and pressure circle go on and on and on. Man cannot change the world around him. He cannot prevent the experience relationships which he must have. To escape them, to run away from them, to avoid them or evade them is tragedy. He cannot directly change the subject of self-consciousness because it is the consequence of what he is. And to change it and make it contrary to what he is would be to make it a lie. If the troubled consciousness of the individual stopped troubling him, and he at the same time had made no corrective in himself, then the value of consciousness would be totally lost because its honesty would be gone. It remains that one of these parts, however, is vulnerable. And that part which is vulnerable is the interpretive level. We know this because we recognize that an individual may, under certain conditions, have some experience or something occur to him which is so dynamic, so real, so important, and so obvious that it does change his interpretive pattern. And from that time on, he interprets differently. We know, for instance, that a person, I knew one not long ago, who having lived a comparatively godless existence, in a great emergency was convinced by a friend of the importance of God. And in his extremity, this individual tried prayer. The consequence in his own nature was so tremendous that one moment of faith became intensely meaningful to him. And he became, in his own quiet, non-sectarian way, a very strong and deep believer. The change was immediately manifested in every part of his life because he began to interpret things differently. And as his interpretations changed in a few months, many of his relationships with society changed. Thus, this interpretive power can be altered, can be conditioned in various ways. And to a large degree, what we call study for self-improvement is directed toward this interpretive level. The individual who has been very bigoted in his religion, for one reason or another, is called to a consideration of comparative religion, begins to observe the beauty in other faiths, and his own bigotry fades away. He doesn't attack it. He simply does not support it. He has seen something better. Thus, wherever we are able to modify or change the pattern of human acceptances and rejections, we find a change in the ego pressure. We find that self-consciousness instantly takes on a new appearance, because it has no appearance other than that which we confer upon it by our own interpretation of living. This led the Eastern and also mystical Christian groups to contemplate the mystery of the remedy for these inconsistencies of living through a quiet, detached, honest, faith-strengthened contemplation of living. The individual was encouraged to be quiet, to think things through gently and impersonally. And when he began to think in these terms, he also began to realize that undoubtedly this is the message that life has been trying to tell him from the beginning, but to which he would not give an ear. The moment he begins to relax the tyranny of his own interpretation, he becomes receptive to real meaning. Life around all of us is a complicated symbolism. And for the most part, it is like a mirror in which we see ourselves reflected. The individual who approaches life with a contemplative honesty begins to recognize the tremendous instructiveness of the processes going on around him. As soon as he becomes interested in living, he finds also that he takes the emphasis off of self-interest. A person who is self-centered is simply an individual who is not interested in truth, who does not recognize that there is anything more interesting in space than himself. The moment this person breaks through, either on an intellectual level into the contemplation of a larger universe, or on an emotional level into the acceptance of some responsibility greater than self, expressed perhaps through love, which is a kind of self-forgetfulness in the service of the needs, desires, or happiness of another. The moment self loses its tremendous central magnetic power, the individual begins to relax, begins to let down his defenses, and becomes receptive to experience in its own right, or according to its own substance and nature. We can, of course, go further than the mere acceptance of these things. We can make a conscious effort to advance this kind of understanding. And we do this by intentional and effortful contemplation. We do it by making a resolution to seek for these values, which we suspect more and more strongly to be there. Thus we in a way become members of the great medieval orders of the quest, the knight errant riding out in search of truth. The moment we make truth our goal, the moment we become more interested in reality than in the gratification of self, we begin to break this terrible bondage which controls most of us. And in so doing, we perform the greatest possible service to self, because we begin the process of ennobling self. And self becomes a focal center for the radiation of our new incentives, our new ideals, and our new and greater purposes. We know, for example, that on a simple level of human affairs, the individual who is busy and therefore does not spend his time thinking about himself has a happier life than the person who is in leisure and has the opportunity to spend too much time being sorry for himself. Most neurotics are lonely people. They are isolated people, either through their own choice or through their conduct. They are comparatively friendless. These people then have the time to be sorry for themselves. And there is no disease that develops more rapidly or which in the end is more disastrous. Thus, the individual who removes the self-equation from the weighing of experience becomes receptive to an increasing inflow of facts, of realities, of things as they actually are. And as fact is the food of consciousness, good food, well prepared, makes possible the growth of consciousness. It is very much as though we again think on the level of food and eating. Suppose we have a very fine garden in which we grow many splendid fruits and vegetables. We also have a very happy individual who likes and enjoys good food. So we seat the individual at the table, place the plate in front of him, and bring in the meal. But between the garden and the customer, the food has gone through the kitchen. It has passed through the modifying circumstances of the cook. The very best food can be ruined in the kitchen and can appear on the table in such a lamentable condition that no one can eat it. On the other hand, food which might at first not seem too promising, with the skill of the chef, becomes a great and delightful delicacy. So the chef becomes important. And between the man's spiritual diet and the final self-consciousness which must eat the food is the chef, consisting of man's total mental and emotional organism, which can either prepare this food tastefully or make it unpalatable and totally indigestible. This means that the temperament and the disposition of the person determines the acceptability of the finished product. Through contemplation, we try to make possible that the distribution of realities within the nature of the individual is as complete as possible. We try to make sure that nothing that is valuable is lost, and also nothing that is unreal is permitted to pass on into consciousness to become the source of pressure. Now, what is our contemplative problem factually? Contemplation is man's ability to relax to the consideration of experience. It is the individual trying to, for a moment at least, take on the impartial, impersonal attitude of a jurist, sitting down quietly with the fact, or with the day, or with the life, or with the problem, and trying to understand it without self-interest. Always remembering that the traditional figure of justice is blindfolded, so that it will not be influenced by appearances. So the individual must escape from appearances and search only for those things which are essentially true. And arriving at truth must have the courage to accept it, and by so doing incorporate it into his self-consciousness mechanism. Now, he will not and cannot, at this stage of his growth, completely eliminate self. Because, after all, self is the very mechanism upon which he must depend for all of his energies. But he can reduce the abnormal and unreasonable elements of self-pressure and bring himself into the normalcy range for the humanity at the degree of evolution which ours has reached. Once he is within the normalcy range, he will find that most of his troubles rapidly diminish. They will not diminish, however, simply from battling and pressure on the level of error. The simplest method of contemplation, therefore, is to substitute it for these various critical, negative, interpretive processes that we normally, instinctively employ. Man spends far more time than he realizes in self-pity, in gossip, in criticism, in worry, and in fear. All of this time is a total loss. And when we take this type of time out of man's life, we make a considerable hole in his available energy resources. These are all forms of contemplation, by the way, but they are false forms. He is using the same energies in self-pity that he would be likely to use in self-analysis. Contemplation is the acceptance of experience also as basic education. For after all, as man's mind may be trained in school, his self or his ego is trained in the school of experience. If he rejects experience, he fails to grow inwardly. And when his mind, emotions, and body grow more rapidly than his person, we then have the inconsistencies and the terrible dangers that we confront when skill exceeds integrity. And this can happen in anyone's life to a certain measure and degree. So by contemplation, the mystic, the Eastern saint and scholar, means a period set aside to quietude. The individual finding an oasis of calm in a desert of confusion. He sits down quietly, begins to think through the purpose for himself, his origin, his nature, his destiny, and begins to measure his larger needs in terms of his smaller ones. He begins to think through the question of what will tomorrow be like if we do nothing about it. And he may even ask himself if he has the courage to endure another 20 or 30 years of the same kind of living that is burdening him today. By degrees, out of the confusion, there begins to emerge a pattern. And this pattern is basically a very simple one. Namely, that if we want to be better, we must do something about it. Once having come to this rather obvious, but at the same time rarely experienced decision, the individual must vitalize that decision. It is not enough that he shall decide that sometime he will do something about it, and then promptly forget the whole thing. It is necessary for this decision to be vitalized by the flow of libido or energy, so that it becomes a positive path of purpose. Usually, nature gives us this incentive out of desperation. The individual reaches finally a climax in which he must change, because the situation is too painful and too impossible to endure any longer. Man does not have to wait, however, for this ultimate. He may choose to make certain improvements at any time he so desires. Now he must also bear in mind that these changes and these improvements do not represent the neglect of anything else. It is not a long and arduous procedure so that he must quit work or do anything of so strenuous a nature. It merely represents the gradual development of an attitude. Now man works and plays and lives and even sleeps with attitude. We each of us have a prevalent attitude which dominates our conduct no matter whether we realize it or not. It's there every minute. The point of to be achieved, of course, is that this attitude should be the constructive, contemplative attitude, not something that we engender for 15 minutes in the evening or something of that nature, but a continuous attitude, just as our present critical thinking is continuous, or our dissatisfaction is continuous, or our tendency to fear is continuous. These negative attitudes are with us always, and it is only right that positive attitudes should also be with us always. For one positive attitude can dissolve many negative ones. Contemplation is thus the gradual acceptance of a lawful universe, a reasonable purpose for self, and an understanding of the laws that govern the conduct of self, so that whether we are consciously aware or not, we are instinctively doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing. That instinctively we are kind. Instinctively we are progressive. Not because we have fought out the problem of unkindness, but because through a gradual interpretation of experience, we have justified the fact of kindness. We have realized and learned and known that these positive things are true, that they are dependable, and that upon them we should build our living. If then we begin to think first a little, then perhaps a little more, along these lines, taking positive, constructive, creative relationships to life, these will become habitual. And constructive contemplation is a habit which once developed will never be rejected. Because with this comes the gradual unfoldment and growth of the person, who is therefore compatible with himself and with his body and with his world. He also finds that the correction of these pressures will not only result in emotional and mental happiness, but will increase bodily efficiency and will free the mind from destructive habits which detract from its creativity and productivity on every level. The individual burdened with fear, grief, suspicion, and jealousy can do no job as well as he could if he did not have these detriments. And as long as living is an experience which should be met with every possible creative and constructive attitude, there is no reason for persons to drag themselves through the years burdened by their own thinking. To realize this, to know it, is to begin to improve and to change. But of course the important factor always is that all growth, contemplative and otherwise, must begin with a statement of faith. Man must believe in the good to be attained, because he cannot begin with the good. If he could begin with the good, the growth would be unnecessary. But as growth must terminate in good, the individual must grow because of faith in good. Now this type of faith is not indefinite. It does not mean that he must go on year after year believing something that he can never prove. If faith is real, It requires only one direct expression of itself before confirming evidence begins to be available. The individual, therefore, who, realizing through a faith that is within him that good is attainable, and having certain proof even of this in the lives of other persons who have lived better than he has, he needs only to have this basic statement of faith. The moment he applies it, it becomes involved in his interpretation mechanism. And then everything that happens to him will prove the validity of his new attitude. As his understanding grows, he will have more and more proof by interpretation of the value and fact of this condition in the universe around him. He will find that these various experiences and impacts which he has passed through will begin to tell him the story of faith instead of the story of fear. He will find that beneath the phobia that he had is a friendly universe he has never known. He will discover that to the degree that he is a friend, he will have a friend. And that moment the capacity for true friendship arises in him, he will recognize it in others. The moment he has a capacity for peace within his own nature, he will experience peace. And he will also find that others have this capacity. And various doubts and fears and conflicts on religious and philosophical questions will disappear from his experience. He will discover through the interpretive power that he has that the universe will support with its full strength and full measure all of his constructive instincts. All right, you may say, what have we here then but two forms of self-hypnosis? The individual, being miserable, found through interpretation a miserable universe. Another individual, being happy, found through interpretation a happy universe. Then what is the universe? Is it merely, again, an expression of what we see? Buddha would say yes. That the universe is happy or unhappy according to us. For we are the maker and breaker of all patterns which affect us. But there is one other point which is of some modern scientific interest. If we want to say that both of these things are not provable in themselves, and therefore we have no more right to say the universe is good than we have to say that it is bad. We have no more right to assume that happiness is less of a delusion than misery. Let us point out that nature gives us the answer. Nature reserves for those with the constructive approach every reward conceivable in factual things, and punishes the negative approach with every penalty conceivable. Therefore, nature is telling us, false or true, real or unreal, that nature wishes us to enter into this state of positive adjustment with existence. Nature cannot be denied. The individual who takes the negative attitude has ulcers. The individual who takes the positive attitude does not have ulcers. The attitudes may be an illusion, but an ulcer is a little more tangible. Nature is reserving always every reward for the individual who is positively creative. And nature is forever spanking the individual who is negatively destructive. So there must be more to it than two delusions. Because man's growth is not a delusion. his security and his integrities are not delusions. For by them factual things are accomplished, and delusions do not produce facts. They produce only other delusions. The choice, then, of either drifting along with negative thinking or affirming association with constructive endeavor is a choice between sickness and health, between misery and security. And also, in the experience of mankind, it is the decision between destructivity and constructivity. The great work of the world has been done by idealists. The great tragedies of mankind have been committed by persons with inadequate ideals. Thus progress, essential progress, such as we have of it, belongs to those who have chosen to cling to inner truth. Under such conditions, we cannot assume that misery and happiness are equally illusions. We can say that false happiness based upon passing inaccurate decisions can be illusionary because it will pass away. But happiness which results from the interior growth of the individual and represents essential progress brings him nearer and nearer to an ideal state and advances every cause with which human society has been essentially concerned since the beginning of history. We cannot assume, therefore, that such a thing is an illusion. If it is an illusion, and everything is an illusion, then it is obviously a good thing for man to choose that illusion which is of the greatest good to himself and others. Any way you wish to look at it, on any level of interpretation, of acceptance or unbelief, man's constructive addiction to a sincere search for realities and an acceptance within himself that realities are good and that the service of them are the core and source of man's security. These things are rational, reasonable, factual attitudes. So contemplation, active contemplation, is man's approach to life upon this level. The gradual allowing of this attitude to take over and to gradually overcome the negative, destructive, separating attitudes which plague him. And if he does this, he will then find that the entire inner psychic life unfolds like the flower, that the self-consciousness becomes a radiant and beautiful thing like the lotus of the Hindu, in which the eternal being is enthroned as Buddha is seated in the heart of the lotus. Man's five sensory perceptions become five supports of consciousness, and consciousness in turn becomes the basic power or medium by which man can begin to apperceive that which lies beyond self-consciousness and can grow toward it and can build a fuller and more enlightened existence. On these foundations, the psychological reflections of the future must be built, for we've got to finally realize that man's misery and his peace, his fall and his redemption are involved within his own nature. And this is the reason why there is justice. No one can be the victim of the injustice of another. Each individual is the victim of the inadequacy of himself. And building strongly and serenely upon this, the person has the active incentives not to leave his growth to providence, but to assail the problem himself and realize that he can win, and by winning can have a life that is more abundant and a hope that is more real an orientation in the universe that brings him closer to God and to man. And on these foundations, a new level of contemplative integrities is available to him almost immediately. Time's up. Now we have several announcements. Here is one that goes by way of byway. Somebody left an address book at the Forum cafeteria. Among the addresses in it was ours. So we now have the book. Anyone it belongs to should address Mr. Creelman for further details. This ends our present series of lectures, and I would like to call out your attention on the program to the fact that in September 2 courses of activity will be given at our headquarters building. On Wednesday, September 12th, Mr. Drake, our Vice President, will begin to discuss some of the interesting experiences resulting from his recent trip to India, and he will discuss also the psychological problems and the development of psychology and psychological thinking in Asia. He has many interesting things to talk about. Also on Sunday, September 16th, at 2:30 in the afternoon, Mr. Pumphrey will begin a series on psychoanalytic theories of the self. Both of these groups will emphasize to a degree self-counseling and practical guides to self-help and improvement. This afternoon at our headquarters at 3 o'clock there will be open house. The Friends Committee invites you to be present at the library, museum, and offices, which will be open, so that you can look around and refreshments will be served. You are the guests of the Friends Committee of the Society. At this time we will exhibit a small group of Tibetan prints from the monastery in Urga in Mongolia, taken from the ancient Buddhistic and Lamistic woodblocks. These are very rare and scarce prints, and we think many of you will enjoy seeing them. I'd like to also call to your attention our books, and hope that you will begin to remember our book publications and our magazine in connection with your plans for next Christmas, because it's getting closer every minute. We always tell people to buy early so they can read them themselves before they give them away. Also, if you have not given us your name and address, we would be happy to have it for our mailing list so that you can receive the programs for our lecture here, which will begin in October. So please let us have it. Books in general, we call to your attention. There are a number of announcements on the bulletin board, which we hope you will read. And if you have not as yet subscribed to our magazine Horizon, do so, and it will give you reading to take the place of the Sunday morning lectures, keep you out of mischief until we get back. In the meantime, we hope that each one of you will do what Will Rogers used to call a heap of growing, and will be in fine fettle for October, and thank you very much.